All right, I think I'm just gonna get going because we have a very packed hour here and folks will just keep joining slowly. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Storytelling for Social Change. We are so excited that you are joining us today. This is our, I think, fourth year running this webinar, but we have a very special guest today to talk about an upcoming book. So we are pleased to share this with you today. So just some webinar norms. We are recording this webinar. You probably heard the announcement when you came in. Everyone's going to get a link in the follow-up email. So if you know anyone who really wanted to be here but couldn't, don't worry, they'll have a chance to watch later. There are automated captions available in the toolbar if you check out the bottom of your Zoom window. We also have the Q&A function set up, so if you have any questions, please feel free to use that at any point. You don't have to wait until our Q&A session at the end. You can put your questions in there at any time, and we'll go through all of them when we have the time for them. And as well, if you'd like to share, we're excited to hear where you're calling in from. If you want to use the chat for any land acknowledgements, let us know who you are, why you're here. And for us, because we are a remote org, we have staff spread out all over, but our office is located in San Francisco, which is Ramaytush Ohlone land. And so we just want to make sure we make space to acknowledge that. And also shout out a local organization, the Sogorea Land Trust, which is a native-led organization here that does amazing work. And so if you are local to the Bay Area, we highly recommend checking them out and supporting this crucial work. And if you aren't, we also encourage you to look for your local native-led organizations and see what they're doing and how you can support them. So with that, we'll just introduce ourselves. I'm Erin Von Limoges. I'm the Education Program Director at Voice of Witness, and I'll pass it over to Jessica.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Fagan. I am the Education Specialist at Voice of Witness. I will pass to Ella.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm Ella Banerjee. I'm the Community Partnership Manager at VOW. I use she, her pronoun, calling from Ohlone land, also known as Berkeley, California. And I'll pass it over to our very special guest, Katie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Powell, and I'm a professor of English at Virginia Tech, and I also direct the Center for Refugee, Migrant, and Displacement Studies. And Virginia Tech is on the Tutulo-Monacan land and the Eastern Siouan-speaking peoples, and we honor them in the work that we do. And thank you so much for having me, Voice of Witness. I'm really excited to talk to everyone.
And we are so happy to have you here, Katie. So as we kick off, we just wanted to hear a little bit from all of you because we know people are coming from all sorts of different fields today. So just a quick poll to get us started. Curious, how familiar are you with oral history storytelling? So if you're on your computer and on your phone, possibly, you may see the poll just popped up. I'm seeing some folks share their answers now. Totally anonymous, so just let us know. We're just out of curiosity, want to know where everyone's at with their familiarity with oral history. Just going to give folks another few seconds to participate. Perfect. All right, well, look at this. We have quite a range. So we actually have 35% of folks have completed an oral history project, which is really exciting to see here, but also 33% are new to oral history. So an interesting mix of people. Always just curious, for those who are new to oral history and probably new to Voice of Witness, we're very happy to walk you through everything. For those who have completed oral history projects, we hope you're excited to hear more about our new book coming up. So hopefully everyone gets a little something out of today, but thank you for sharing with us. And we'll have more opportunities this year to join us for workshops and trainings if you are new and you want to learn more. So this is good information for us. All right, now I will pass this over to Jessica because we need a definition.
Yes. For those of you especially who are new to oral history, we'll start with just kind of our basics here. So oral history at its, most basic level is a form of storytelling that is based in the spoken word. It is utilized in many different cultures and traditions, and is also used by many institutions to preserve, gather, and interpret first-person accounts, memories, either from particular points of history, from particular communities, or just individual people and families. At Voice of Witness in particular, we think of oral history as a way to democratize and humanize history. We find that too often communities, people are having stories told about them as opposed to having the opportunity and the platform to tell their own stories. So that is what we do as an organization. We lead projects and we also empower people by teaching them the skills to run their own oral history projects in order to, disrupt some of those harmful media narratives that may be out there about people or communities. And more importantly, to allow individuals and communities to share their own stories with the complexity and the dignity and the agency that they want and deserve. So with that, I will pass back over to Erin to talk a little bit more about Voice of Witness and our mission.
Yeah, so for those who are new to Voice of Witness, but maybe not new to oral history, we are a nonprofit, and our goal is to advance human rights by amplifying the voices of those most impacted by and also fighting against injustice. So as Jessica mentioned, we do this through our use of oral history. We very firmly believe that change cannot happen until stories are shared, and most importantly, stories directly from the voices of those impacted. And so while we are based in the San Francisco Bay Area as an organization, we actually work nationwide and even internationally with our lovely book editors and partners, community partners, schools, teachers, communities, anyone who wants to do any of this work. So I'm actually going to send this over to Ella to talk a little bit more about why we chose oral history as our medium and how we use it in so many different ways.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, so as you can see, if we ask the question, why oral history, it's a very dynamic format, and it's such an exciting medium. There's a number of ways you can apply it, all of which we aim to do here at Voice of Witness, which we try to embody in the different programs and departments we have. One of the first ones that you would think of when you think of oral history is narrative change and storytelling. And so at Voice of Witness, one of our key programs is our narrative and book series. And so right now we've published over 22 books in our book series. I think the 23rd is about to come out, edited by Katie next month. So in each of our books, we focus on a different social justice area. There's a range of topics, as Erin was mentioning, from all over the globe, from topics like incarceration and the carceral system, maybe displacement, migration across the globe, really a number of different topics. And in each of our books, we have folks who share their stories with us, that we call them our narrators, share their story from a birth to present day perspective. So you really get a chance to hear from people who are directly impacted by these really important social justice issues. And these are the people who are the experts on these issues. Usually you don't hear from people who are directly impacted. Usually you hear from like politicians or pundits, but not people with that lived experience. So through our book series, we really believe in flipping the script and positioning our narrators, people with lived experience, as the expert on these issues if we want to solve human rights crises and social justice issues. So we really believe in narrative change, and our books are a vehicle of that. How can people read and learn about these stories directly from people's voices and take part in narrative change and begin to think about these stories and issues differently? And we also really value ethical storytelling. So oral history is not just about somebody parachuting in. It's not exactly like traditional journalism where a lot of the power belongs to the editor or the person writing the stories. We really believe in honoring our narrators, their choices, what's important for them, and really seeing them as co-collaborators. We're going to talk a lot about that later in the webinar, but that's really key to what we do, especially in our book series. We also have our education program. Oral history is a wonderful way for people to learn, as you can imagine, learn about these issues in a really accessible format. It's not dense, it's not academic, it's not like a textbook. It's hearing people share their stories. It really comes to life. And so it's a great tool for teaching people of all ages. Not, our education team works with a range of grades from middle school on up. So it's a way to bring these stories directly to the classroom and encourage young people to share their own stories, perform their own oral history projects, which help them develop their, a range of skills from empathy building to writing to deep listening. And finally, we really believe that oral history can be a tool for social change. Through our community partnerships program, we connect with other nonprofits and advocacy groups who do advocacy on behalf of our narrator communities. So we do a number of engagements like workshops on storytelling, helping people develop their stories for if they're going to go to demonstrations or want to put their stories out there to try to advocate for policy changes. We've done things like have our narrators train community members who are going to, demonstrate to talk about things like immigrant justice, immigrant rights. So we really have that connection between our narrators and storytelling and community building. And we really believe these stories can create change and be a tool for advocacy. And I think all of that is encompassed by the tenets of healing and connection. I think that's at the root of all these different applications of oral history. So as you can imagine, we're real geeks and nerds for oral history here. We believe it can be such a powerful tool for change in a lot of different arenas. And I'll pass it back to
for that. Thanks, Ella. So as Ella was saying, there are many, many different applications for oral history, and you all are going to get a chance to hear from some of our narrators and an editor today, and we'll dive more into our approach and our methodology a little bit later on. But before we do that, I wanted to share a quote that really frames our approach to doing oral history at Voice of Witness. And it just so happens to come from one of my all-time favorite authors of all time, Arundhati Roy. She says, "There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." And we like to use this quote because it really speaks to our intention to provide a space and a platform to those who have been marginalized by, whatever areas of society. And it helps to frame our thinking, not that we are giving anybody a voice, but rather we are allowing those who have voices to use them. All right. With that being said, I want to pass things over to Katie to talk about her book that will be coming out in a couple of months here and why she chose oral history as her format for beginning again.
Hi, thanks. And I really appreciate being here with you all. And I'm excited to talk about Beginning Again, Stories of Movement and Migration in Appalachia. And I'll start just by saying why I wanted to do an oral history in Appalachia, bringing together multiple kinds of voices. I studied journalism in college, and my favorite kind of story to do was the longer form feature stories. The news stories were fine, but I really preferred doing the longer form features, mostly because I really like to sit and talk to people about their work or about their lives. And sort of along with that, when I grew up in Appalachia, near the Shenandoah National Park, and I had grown up hearing stories about people who had been displaced from Shenandoah National Park. And of course, the people who had been displaced to form the park were mostly white settlers, but of course the Monacan and Manahoac American Indians had been displaced before that. And so the region, the area of Appalachia generally, and Appalachian Virginia specifically, has long been a state of movement and mobility. And I had heard lots of stories about the displacement of families from the park area. And then as I started to study in graduate school and learn more about the history of the park, I realized that a lot of the published history about Shenandoah National Park didn't match the stories that I had heard growing up. And so that tension between the broader representation of the history of people who lived in the park, and then the actual people's stories about their experiences of living there didn't always match. And it became pretty clear to me how important stories are, how important oral history is in terms of understanding an event or a historical moment. I fast forward to then my job as a professor teaching English. My specialty is autobiography. And so I read and study lots of memoir, diary, storytelling techniques, and of course, oral history. And one of the books that I taught was a novel / autobiography called What is the What, which of course Dave Eggers and Valentino Acak-Dang did together based on Valentino's oral history. And I was very intrigued by the genre play of that. It was an oral history that Dave did with Valentino, and yet it was presented as a novel. And so those of you who have done oral history know that if you read a transcript, it's long, it goes back and forth, it's kind of convoluted sometimes. People talk about the same topic in over time or in different places within the interview. And so to have What is the What written in such a way that was novelistic was such a great way to teach the subject of the memoir, which was Valentino as a lost boy from Sudan. But it was also a way to talk about how stories are told, who gets to tell them, who gets to decide what gets left out. And some of that is addressed in the actual content, but then it's also addressed in the way that book is categorized, in, being a novel and an oral history. And it's a great book to teach. Around the time I was teaching it for the first time, I became aware of voice of witness more generally, and I learned about the books that they produce, the oral histories that they support, and I ordered their anthology and taught it in my own first-year writing class. And it was an amazing tool for teaching writing and teaching students also how to do, the skills of interviewing. And so I was myself having had some experience being an interviewer, but then also learning oral history and some of the nuances of being an oral historian. I did a little bit of formal training, both from Voice of Witness and from Columbia University. When all of this then came together to me wanting to bring together stories of the history of Appalachia and the people who have lived in Appalachia historically and the people who have come to Appalachia more recently. Around 2016-17, there were several kinds of narratives floating around that took me back to that moment when I remembered that the stories I was hearing about Appalachians who had been displaced was not the same story that was in the news. And around 2016-17, the stories of refugees and immigrants coming to this country was kind of a heightened moment in terms of the popular media and the way that refugees and immigrants were being represented. And so I wanted to bring together those narratives in one place so that people's experiences of living in Appalachia, whether as someone who has moved to Appalachia more recently or someone whose family has lived in Appalachia for generations, that those stories could be side by side. I think that there's often negative stereotypes about Appalachia, negative stereotypes about refugees and immigrants. And so I wanted to have those stories be together in one place so that we could hear about the diversity of experience within the region and also hear about the many welcoming moments, even though there are lots of moments of xenophobia and racism in the region. There are also lots of moments of welcoming and welcoming neighbors. So that's how I decided to do the oral history project and a little bit of background on the book.
Thank you so much, Katie, and for all of that context. And we're excited to hear a short excerpt from that book very soon and then learn more about your whole process putting it together. So with that, I want to talk about these narrative excerpts that we've selected. We have 3 very short quotes to share with you today, but just as an example of the wide range of projects we've done and how oral history can really stretch across a large, diverse range of media. So the first is coming from our shorter form online storytelling project. Some of you may have heard about this. It's Unheard Voices of the Pandemic. We'll intro that in just a moment. The second comes from a collaboration with a partner organization based in Southern California and their storytelling project. And then the third is an excerpt from this upcoming book, Beginning Again. And so we'll get to hear from a narrator. But other projects we've done include podcasts and audio storytelling, photo essays and visual storytelling. There's lots of different formats that oral history can take. We are obviously partial to a more literary approach with our book series, but we've worked on a diverse range of projects and hope to keep expanding our repertoire here. So I'm going to let Ella share this excerpt from UVP coming up.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, so this excerpt is from a collection that came out a couple of years ago, and this is a shorter form collection called Unheard Voices of the Pandemic. So in 2020, as the pandemic was beginning and really creating this new world that we were all entering, we really wanted to know how our narrators and our narrator communities were being affected by the pandemic. Our narrator communities are already folks who live at the margins, people who are already underrepresented or under-resourced in so many ways. And so we knew that the pandemic was not an equalizer, as some people were saying, but really was going to be exacerbated and affecting people in different ways. So we wanted to check in with our narrators and see how they were doing, amplify their stories. So for this collection, we didn't do the birth to present day format, but really more of an update with some past narrators from past projects, or some new narrators from people we're connected to through community partners, just to see how are they doing at this moment in time. So this is an example of a shorter form project of oral history, but very much captures an important moment that we can all connect to and see how our narrators were dealing with it. So this excerpt we're going to read is from our narrator, Sherrod McFarland. He was originally a narrator in our book 6x10, Voices from Solitary, which is a book about people who are currently or formerly incarcerated or have loved ones who are incarcerated, and particularly around the experience of being kept in solitary confinement. So Sherrod the story was gathered and edited in May 2020. And during that time, and he, I believe, still is incarcerated at Parnell Correctional Facility in Jackson, Michigan. And Sherrod is someone who has been incarcerated for over 30 years. So he was able to communicate his story with our editor from being on the inside. So this is just an excerpt from Sherrod's story. Living under such conditions is already a high-stress situation, which probably negatively affects your immune system. But having to face the threat of a deadly pandemic ups the ante by 10. I'm not ashamed to say that the fear of death by coronavirus has crossed my mind many times. I'm in my 50s, I have asthma, and I've been in prison nearly 33 years straight, making me one of the more quote-unquote at risk. Some of the other men here are also quite vocal regarding their fears of the virus, but what can we do? That's the end. Okay, that's the end of the excerpt. So thank you to Sherrod, our narrator there, for sharing his story.
And thanks, Ella, for reading that. Our second excerpt comes from the Our Story project, which is an example of a partnership that Voice of Witness did with a community-based organization. In this case, it's the Koreatown Youth and Community Center. So in this project, Voice of Witness staff trained staff at KYCC and volunteers to go out and conduct their own oral history interviews, to edit them, and to compile them into the collection that we have today. The collection specifically was stories that, spanned generations all around the MacArthur Park area of LA, and the stories together formed a collective history of the space, the challenges in maintaining it, and then the general love that the community has for the space as a gathering place. So this is a quote from one of the narrators of this project, Vanessa. We need to come together as a community to clean the park. Sometimes I see people eat a banana and then throw their trash on the ground, even if the trash can is right in front of them. A lot of people who smoke don't put out their cigarettes in the proper place. It's dangerous for the animals and also bad for the community. Maybe we can have more education for the homeless people at the park. Sometimes they are on the street and don't even know where they can get a shower, eat, or have other options for places to stay. Sometimes they just need somebody to help them.
And now we're going to be hearing from Katie, if you want to just share a little bit about Micaiah, who has a short quote in this section.
So Micaiah is a young Black man who lives in Big Stone Gap, Virginia, which is in the heart of Appalachia. And what's really great about his story and very interesting is his leadership role in the youth movement. There's a youth movement called the Stay Project, which is dedicated to helping Appalachian youth be able to stay in Appalachia. There's often some economic hardships in some of the areas, and finding employment, especially in rural areas, is very difficult. And so there's been a collective of youth who are committed to helping find employment. And Micaiah is a leader in that group. And he's a really jovial person, very friendly, and is a great storyteller. And part of what was really interesting about his story is his desire to stay in the mountains, live in the mountains, and live where his family had lived for generations.
This is Micaiah's story. When I was younger, I remember talking to my friends and they'd all say, "We can't wait to leave." But I'd say, "I love it here. I love the mountains. I love being able to go outside to just sniff the air and have an almost overwhelming sense of nostalgia for how this place has shaped me to be who I am." Big Stone Gap is not perfect and it has its issues, but if we all leave, it's never going to get better. It's never going to be the community that we want to see. One day I plan on starting a family, and I want to at least have the option to build my family here, to raise my family here, and then they raise their kids here if they want to. They should at least have that option. But we won't have that option if we don't have safe, inclusive communities. If we all just decided that Appalachia's irredeemable and can't be safe, then who's going to fix it while we're all away? And I'd like to share that, that Micaiah is actually going to be at our launch event in just a month for this book. So if you want to hear more from him directly, please join us then, and you'll get to hear a little bit more from his story and from his experience sharing this narrative with us. But now that we've read a few of these excerpts, I'd love to hear if you have anything in your reflection that you want to share in the chat. Just going to give you a moment to type in there and share with everyone. You know, even if it's just one word about how you're feeling after reading this, we'd love to hear it. I know we just shared 3 very short, quick excerpts from 3 very different projects. And I see some questions coming in, and I promise we'll get to these in our Q&A later. All right, well, I keep populating questions, keep populating thoughts. Remember, you can use the chat for any reflections, and you can put any questions you have that are coming up for you right now in the Q&A section. You should find it in your toolbar. We will address them all right after this next section of our webinar. We'll make space for all of those. But now that we've heard some examples of our oral history projects, I'm going to ask Katie to actually walk us through her process of collecting stories for Beginning Again and how she found narrators and walked through this entire series. So before she jumps in, this is what we're asking Katie to run through very quickly in 20 minutes, but this is just an overview of sort of beginning to end of how we work. So finding the narrators, crafting storytelling questions, the whole interview process itself, then turning them into shareable stories. So Katie, I will let you take it away from here, and I'll just show some of your pictures as we go on. Katie, I think you're still muted.
Thank you. Thank you all for the questions too. I can see popping up in the chat. I look forward to talking about those. So oral history and talking to people about their life stories really does require some degree of trust. And that can come just from knowing people and kind of being from an area and sort of having an insider insight into a place and just knowing people. But it also can happen during an interview and when you meet someone for the first time. And so I direct the Center for Refugee, Migrant, and Displacement Studies, and together we all come together to practice doing oral history and learning some of the technology that's available to do that. Some of the picture here is of us learning how to use some professional grade recording equipment, which is really great. But also to learn from each other about who might be willing to share their story, who has a good story. And as we started to figure out the theme of this book to be about people who have moved or are moving into Appalachia or have moved within Appalachia, we started to share with each other the connections with people who we thought might be willing to tell their stories. And so a lot of it was by word of mouth. Some of it was like Bob Akir, for instance. We knew his story because his story had been published in the newspaper. It turned out later that someone had actually known him, you know, how small communities work. And so we just started first by interviewing a few people and working with local community members, but also with our own connections. And then from there, it snowballed to finding some other people, some who the narrators knew, and some who our students at Virginia Tech knew, and some from people out in the community. And also, I think, you know, building that chain of trust can occur on an institutional level. So Virginia Tech is kind of a double-edged sword that people, I think, around this area understand Virginia Tech to be an educational institution. And yet Virginia Tech has a history of not working so well within the community. So sometimes you have to overcome that if you belong to an institution, how to overcome that and to talk to people about the purpose of what you're doing and to really tell them. I spend a lot of time telling people why I think their story is so important. And a lot of the people I tend to talk to are a little shy about sharing their story. But and this goes back to the original question of why oral history as a platform. It so augments what's published about an historical event or an historical moment. And so having someone's individual perspective augments our history. And so I spend some time talking to narrators about that. The other aspect of that is focusing on a person's entire life, what Voice of Witness calls birth to now. And this is so key because, and why I like oral history as opposed to ethnographic interviews. In ethnographic interviewing, often the questions are very focused on someone's identity as a refugee or identity as a flood survivor. And journalists do this too. You interview someone about the moment or about a particular event or a particular aspect of their identity. And what oral history allows for is to get to know the person as a whole person so that their story or their identity isn't reduced to their refugee-ness or their immigrant-ness. It's a part of their entire story. And so then when you devise some questions to ask someone, it includes questions about how they grew up, what their hopes and dreams are, and those kinds of things then get put in context to the subject matter that you might be interested in, like their move from one country to another, or their move from one place to another. And that often can create some trust with the narrator. They just get talking and get comfortable with sharing their story. But it also then, I think, lets them know that you appreciate them and their whole personhood, not just one aspect of their personhood. Thank you. So preparing for the interviews. So this photograph, I love this because we were doing some oral histories in our center with parents, but we offered them childcare so that they could come visit with us and yet also have their kids be cared for at the same time. And so these are another professor and a student were teaching the children how to use the equipment. And so they were interviewing each other and singing into the microphones and recording themselves. It was great. So preparing for the interview includes that kind of thing, like what kind of environment would someone be comfortable in? Would they be comfortable coming to an institution like Virginia Tech in a small classroom? Would it be better to meet at a coffee shop in a public place? Would it be better, would they feel more comfortable being interviewed in their home? And I think that's a lot to ask someone to have you in their home. And yet it also can be a place that's more comfortable for them, especially in terms of issues of childcare and families. And so part of what we do and what Voice of Witness encourages is to know, to do some background research on the individual person, but also about an issue. And this, I think, depends on the editor or the people conducting the interviews. We all have a variety of knowledges about a particular event or human rights issue, but being prepared both in terms of content matter, but also in terms of a variety of kinds of answers to questions, and also being prepared, and especially if you're doing interviewing about a traumatic event or a traumatic experience, being prepared to help the person manage talking about that traumatic event. There are lots of resources available about trauma-informed interviewing. And I think for our students, this was particularly helpful. They were worried about if someone got upset during an interview, how they might react and respond. And we talk a lot about caring for ourselves as interviewers and holding space for someone's story. And always offering that a narrator can stop the interview at any time, and just, being human in those moments, and also offering to follow up another time. But also the thing about follow-ups is really interesting because 1 hour long interview, and usually an interview lasts about 60 to 90 minutes. It's a lot to ask someone to talk to you and tell their story for more than an hour and a half at a time. It's also, it's a lot of work for you as well in terms of listening and the work of conducting the interview. And so often follow-ups are a great way to do some fact checking, but also just to get some more details about a particular part of a person's stories. It gives them a chance. People who've been interviewed often will reflect and wish that they had shared some other aspect of the story. So follow-ups allow for that. I'll also say one preparation that we did, this reminds me, we often do some training beforehand where people interview each other. So you get the experience conducting an interview and also being interviewed, so that it's really important to understand what it feels like to be interviewed. One of the exercises I really like to do is have pair up people, and the pairs interview each other each for 10 minutes. So you get interviewed for 10 minutes, and then you interview someone else for 10 minutes. And then you have to present back to the larger group in less than 30 seconds. And that exercise is interesting because you get to hear your own story be reduced to 30 seconds. And it's an interesting thing to go through because you spend 10 minutes giving all these details, and the person who interviewed you narrows it all down to 30 seconds. And I think it's really important for first-time interviewers to go through some sort of exercise like that to see what it's like to have your story edited, and then also, of course, get the practice to ask questions. So I saw some questions popping up in the chat specifically about transcribing and editing and collaborating with the narrators and then sharing stories. The transcription is a really important artifact of the oral history interview. You have the recording, whether that's a video or audio recording, but the transcription is great, and it's important, I think, to make that available and archive that. And I really encourage you to work with either the local library or an educational institution that might have an oral history center, or just the archives at the library, like at Virginia Tech. They're really interested in archiving these things. Of course, you have to go through the proper permissions to be able to do that. But I really encourage you to do that because those stories then can be shared and thought about in multiple kinds of ways, not just the ways that you have thought about it in terms of your own project. And so the transcription is great because then you can study the written word, the interview as it happened. And the editing process is it's really difficult and takes a long time. And working with Voice of Witness was really helpful with this in terms of, if you have, let's say, a 20-page or 25-page transcription, that's sort of difficult for someone to read, for anyone else to read if you're not the actual interviewer or doing some research. But if you want to just read about the person's story, editing it down to, let's say, 6 or 7 pages or 8 or 10 pages, you can take those storytelling techniques, novelistic techniques, and beginning, middle, and end sort of thing, or thematic ways to break it down. You'll notice in Voice of Witness books, there are often subheadings that kind of give you an idea of what that section is about. And it basically just turns a transcription into a more accessible document that's a little shorter to read and a little easier to read in terms of an arc of a story. But that requires a lot of collaboration with editors and with the narrators themselves. So we share the edited versions of their transcriptions. We share both with them, their full transcription, and the actual audio recording, and then the edited versions. And then the narrators have a chance to either add more details or delete things if they weren't comfortable with some piece of their story being shared. And then there's multiple opportunities for the narrators to withdraw their story completely or to change some aspects of the story, and then ultimately sharing either excerpts of their story in webinars like this one, or to share the story in the book itself.
Thanks so much, Katie, for walking us through this whole process. I know we haven't launched the book yet, but I'm curious if you can also share maybe something you're really looking forward to once these stories are out in the world very soon.
Yes, I'm really excited to hold the launch event, and I understand Micaiah will be there. We're working on also a couple of in-person events where I also hope several of the narrators will be able to come, because hearing people's voices and hearing their stories in their own words is really great, and they're excited about it. I think this is a picture of Babakir, who came as a refugee and had to leave his wife and children behind, and they were separated for a long time, and they're finally in the country. And so his story about that separation and working so hard to get his education while waiting for his family to arrive, waiting for years, is really powerful and is better heard through his voice. So I'm looking forward to those events where they can further tell their stories and also provide some updates as well.
Thanks so much, Katie. So before we move into Q&A, I did want to make some space. Ella, I'm going to invite you to just walk us through some of these essential questions that we ask ourselves around the ethics of storytelling. And I know these will reflect some of the questions we've seen in our chat pop up as well.
Yeah, I think it's awesome that people have already been asking a lot of questions around ethics. And I think as we think about ethics with storytelling, I think it's really important to note that it isn't a static thing. It's something to constantly be considering at every stage of a project, before you contact narrators, during and after. It's something that's continuous and always evolving and important to always like revisit and check in about. But a key question we think about is, how do we create a safe and brave space for people to share their stories? And so to use this term, we want to create a space where people feel comfortable sharing something that is so vulnerable, so personal, potentially something that very intense that's happened to them. But we also include the word brave because we want to acknowledge that, we only have so much control, especially after a story goes out there in the world. We want to acknowledge that we don't know how people will fully react or what will necessarily happen with the story or how people might feel. So we want to acknowledge the bravery that people have. So when we think about that question and how to maintain it, we think about, logistics, like we already talked about, where to do an interview, like literally thinking about location. Is it at someone's home? Maybe they're actually more comfortable in a public place. Thinking about logistics, like time, is there food there? Is there childcare? But also things like more abstract things like values and trust. Like, how can I make sure that people know who we are, that maybe, for example, they want to do their interview in their native language they're most comfortable speaking, and maybe not only have an interpreter there who speaks that language, but someone who's also a native speaker, because that will make them feel the most comfortable. So things like that to really honor what we can do to support people to feel as safe and brave as possible to share their story. And also thinking about questions of ownership, right? Often people might be like, well, if my name is on the cover of the book as the editor, does it belong to me? But really, that's something we push against. We want to think about these are the stories of our narrators. It belongs to them. It's their stories. How can we be really transparent and thoughtful in communicating, who, someone might be an editor is going to be editing the transcripts and changing it, which is an inherent change, and acknowledging that. But how can we do things like making sure narrators see drafts, so we get final approval, that they get copies of the book, that they get to be part of outreach if they want to. So really being transparent and thoughtful about how we continue to think about co-collaboration. Maybe Erin, you want to take the next bullet point?
Yeah, we also want to make sure that we approach everything with a trauma-informed approach. Obviously, this is a very big umbrella. We have resources on this, and lots of other folks have put out amazing resources around this, but really it's about centering the narrator's experience, right? We want to make sure this is an opt-in. The story you're ready to tell is the story we want to hear, and just making sure that people feel supported, not just during the interview, but also afterward. Where are you going after this? Who are you going to talk to? Who can you debrief about this very vulnerable experience with? And so making sure that preparing for the interview, as Katie mentioned, is not just what recording equipment do I use, but rather all those logistics, like she mentioned, around childcare, around family, around responsibilities. Those are all things to consider when you want to enter into an ethical, trauma-informed approach. And of course, our positionality really matters, right? What are the insider-outsider dynamics in our relationships with the person we're talking to? And perhaps the most important question, are we the right people to share these stories? Are we the right ones to do this interview in the first place? Ella mentioned having the right language, the right interpreter, the right native speakers around, but also sometimes it's saying, this isn't my project. This is actually meant to be with someone else, and someone else within this community should do it. And so being self-aware enough to sometimes realize the projects are in better hands elsewhere is actually the most ethical thing you can consider when you're thinking about these power dynamics.
And there's literally so much more to talk about when we think about the ethics around storytelling. So in the chat, we've dropped our ethical storytelling principles landing page on our website, which kind of goes through this framework. I think that's actually being shared in the chat. that's a great place to learn more. There it is. There's a great place to learn more about more in depth some of these principles. And then also we have a book called Say It Forward, A Guide to Social Justice Storytelling. And this is different from everything else in our series because it reads much more like a primer on oral history. It's an introduction in depth to our methodology and our approach, and also includes field notes from other community projects, including non-VAL ones. So you can read from people, how did they approach some of these similar questions that might come up for you in their own work.
So we've finally reached our Q&A section. I know there's lots of questions. I hope some of them were covered in what we were saying, but I did want to highlight a couple, and I'll just direct them to some of our lovely panelists. But Katie, I'd love to hear from you. How did you end up deciding whose voices ended up in the book in this final product?
That was difficult because for this project we did almost 100 interviews, and so in a book project, this particular book ended up being 12 narratives, and so we just went through a process of kind of a combination of a diverse set of people with different kinds of experiences, and trying to hear multiple kinds of stories within the same book project, and also the stories that we thought were compelling. I mean, they were all compelling, so it's often a really difficult decision. There were a few I wish were in there. There are a few I wish were in there that originally were going to be in there, and then the person withdrew themselves. They didn't. Once we really got into the moment of it becoming really real for them, that their story would be public, they were uncomfortable with that, and so of course I was disappointed, and yet obviously have to respect the person's decision. So it's kind of a multi-phased project of or process of imagining the book as a whole. And in some ways I imagined the book as a whole to start with, but then once the actual narrative started to take shape, the book began to take its own shape and form. So some of the decisions I thought I would make in the beginning ended up being a little bit different in the end, because the book itself started to emerge, and the ways that the stories went together, the partnering or the pairing of a couple of stories bouncing off one another, even the order of the narratives was talked about a lot. And so that's just the work of an editor. And, I did a lot of that editing, but the Voice of Witness team also really helped with that in terms of their own experience of having done this before, and just, providing some feedback. So it was really actually a very collaborative process. There is a question in here about compensating narrators, and I will say I feel like it's very important to compensate someone for their time, and the Voice of Witness project is committed to doing that, and so all the narrators are compensated. It's a modest compensation, but it's also a way of highlighting to them how important their stories are.
Yeah, thank you for addressing that, Katie. If you want to read more about that, our good friend Fanny Garcia has a great article on this very topic as well. Ella, I wonder if you could talk a bit. There's a question here about other formats of oral history. So not just our book series, but rather other platforms, other media. And so I'm curious if you could talk about our interest in those fields and other people doing that kind of work.
Yeah, I think there's so many different great examples. I think, when people think about oral history, they'd often think about audio. And so hearing from audio conversations or excerpts is a great way to engage with oral history. StoryCorps is a great example. They have short excerpts from conversations that people have that you can hear on a number of different topics, and they're really free flowing, these conversations between two different people. I used to work for StoryCorps, so I love the stories that they produce. I think even thinking about how is oral history being used in advocacy settings, right? Like if you're reading people sharing their testimony, they might call it testimony, but I do think that is like in some ways a version of oral history, and that's a larger discussion on like whether we call it that or not. But I do think thinking about, you know, if I'm reading something from a campaign, am I seeing a kind of extended quote or an excerpt that is clearly from someone and them talking about their experience in their words, which I think is really important. I think also the ways that oral history and testimony can be incorporated in theater and dramatic arts is really exciting. One of our books, Voices from the Storm, which is about Hurricane Katrina and people's experiences during that time, was adapted into a play performed by high schoolers, which I think is really cool. Right now, we're at Voice of Witness and myself, we're working with East Bay Sanctuary Covenant, which is an amazing Bay Area Immigrant Justice Center, and we're working and do with both people who have acting and theater backgrounds, as well as ourselves doing oral history, to do a theater project where people who are immigrants and refugees, including people from the Maya Mom speaking community, are using the tools of oral history and theater kind of blended to share their experiences. So I think there really are just so many different ways to think about how is someone sharing their first person narrative. So that's just a smattering, but there really is a lot out there.
And I know there's a question here about editing our transcripts, and that's a much longer answer. I don't think we're going to get too deep into here. I will say we are a little more heavy-handed than other oral historians may be with our literary projects, with our book series. But if you want to learn more, we run a summer workshop series. It'll start this late July into August, and there's one session dedicated to transcribing and editing. So highly recommend signing up for that if you want to really dive into our technique around editing. But there's one question here that I think, Jessica, it might be fun to hear from you. It's about what types of small projects have worked well? And so maybe you can tell us a bit about some student-led projects that are very short-term and look a little different from what we do with adults.
Sure, yeah. Working with students is really exciting in some of the ways that Ella was talking about, because oral history can be your sort of centerpiece to create projects that exist and live in a lot of different mediums and formats. I would say that if you have one day to do an oral history project, you could do an artifact interview where everybody that all of your participants bring in an object that's personally or culturally significant to them and practice, the oral history technique around this artifact. If you have, a couple of days, a couple of weeks, we've led students through creating an oral history cookbook where they've talked to family members about a recipe significant in their families, and then use quotes and learnings from those interviews to compile a cookbook. Longer form projects could include a student podcast. We have also done, similar to what Ella was saying, student monologue projects, where they have taken the transcripts of oral history interviews, similar to the process that we use in our book series, turned them into a first person narrative, and then performed those as monologues. And we've done also some short video projects. It really depends on, the sort of amount of time and the learning objectives or goals that you have for your project. But we have tons of resources available on our website, which we will link for you. If any of those projects sound interesting to you, we have lots of guides and tips for making those happen.
All right, so before we close out, I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but we'll try to address as many as we can in the follow-up email that we're sending out to everyone registered. And in that email, you can always respond directly, and we're happy to chat more about any of the topics you've brought up today. But before we close out, I would love to hear if there was an aha moment for you today, something new you learned or something interesting you were reflecting on. And if you want to throw that in the chat, we'd love to see it. But as you're sharing those, we just want to remind you all of all the ways you can stay in touch with us.
Yeah, so I saw a lot of people were interested in our workshop series that's more in depth, happening in August. So please check out that workshop, as well as our Beginning Again launch we're referring to, that's going to be on June 20th at 5 p.m. Eastern time. If you follow us on, if you sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media, you'll be able to see those links for both the workshop and the Beginning Again event coming up soon. So keep an eye out for those. please download some of our free oral history resources and lesson plans. They cover some of the questions and the topics that we talked about today. And we would love to work with you. You can explore our different services, from consultancies to partnerships and workshops. We're down to work with you in a number of different ways, and we can tailor it to your needs as well as your capacities and budgets. Please also read our books. You know, we talk about narrative change. The first thing we think of with oral history. And so that starts with reading the narratives. Please read them, share them, including Beginning Again, which is coming out, but also the other books in our series. We are a nonprofit, so if you're able to, please consider donating to support us continuing to be able to share free resources and ongoing work. If you have any questions, we try to pack it as much as we could in this short hour, but if you do have questions, please reach out to us at edu@voiceofwitness.org, and you can follow us on social media, again, to find out about our different projects that we have, and the ongoing work that we're doing. So thank you all so much for joining us today. This was such a pleasure to get to connect with all of you and to talk about storytelling.